Welcome to Focus on the Masters and this segment of our Artist Spotlight series. Focus on the Masters is a nonprofit arts education program which documents contemporary artists. We document artists and their work through photographic portraits, audio and video interviews, and biographical research that encompass each artist's experiences, artistic reflections, and development. We then present this work to a broad public through extensive educational programs like the one you are about to see. We also present our Learning to See Youth Outreach Program, a monthly Meet the Artist series, regular exhibitions, and publications. This segment will feature ceramist and community leader Maggie Kildee. Portions of this program were recorded before a live studio audience. We hope you enjoy the program, and we thank you for your generous support.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome Maggie Kildee to our program. Thanks for being here. Maggie, it's so nice to have you. You are such a great example of what we look for in our artists who not only have tremendous talent as an artist, but also individuals who have made a huge difference in our community. And you truly are one of these people that have left a tremendous legacy. Share with us a little bit about the beginnings of your life and where you were reared and a little bit about your family background.
All right, well, first of all, though, thank you, and it's a real honor to be here. It's an incredible honor to have an audience like this here, and so thank you to all of you who've come to share. This is a very special evening. Well, once upon a time, a long time ago, I was born in Glendale, California, so I'm a native Californian. For someone my age, that's not real common. I was the oldest child of two. I have a sister who is actually here tonight, which is a real thrill for me.
Sure.
This is my mother and my father that you see on the screen. We lived in Glendale. My father, he and my mother had graduated from college, but it was in the very early 30s. Since I was born at 32, they were married just before that. And I don't really know what his jobs were. It was kind of a tough time for people. And the result was that he picked up an ulcer, went to the hospital, successful operation, infection, no sulfa because it wasn't ready yet. And so it actually died of the infection.
And you were very young at that time?
Yes, I was only 5. And the fact that my father had died and my mother went back to school to get a teaching credential, those two things made a big impression on me and dictated some of the decisions I made later in life.
And of course, this was during the Depression. And so the stress of providing for a family, and the fact that your mother was educated and had a degree also was a little bit of an anomaly at that time as well. So she was a great role model for you.
She was, and we had a lot of fun growing up. We would go camping, go up to Pismo and you know, El Capitan, that sort of thing.
Just the mother and the 2 daughters?
And the 2 daughters, right. She'd take a tent, we'd put up a tent, and sometimes we'd go to Carpinteria, just different places, but it was always a good time. She loved to be outdoors. But the other thing that I learned from all of that was that I better get a teaching credential myself. I better be able to take care of myself because of my father having passed away so soon.
So we have a picture of your high school graduation.
Went to high school in Santa Ana, graduated from high school there, and the sad thing about my graduation was that we didn't get to go to Disneyland for graduation.
And why was that?
Because there wasn't a Disneyland yet.
We have a couple of pictures of you when you were in college. Now, were you involved in student government and were part of like the student council or anything like that?
Not really, although as a freshman, all the women were part of groups, freshman groups, and I was the president of that group for a semester. The second year I was with the service organization, the Spurs, and don't ask me why we were called the Spurs, but you can see from the picture that was the emblem. But it was a service organization. There's no more pictures because I graduated from college in about 3 years and I got married during my third year. So any pictures we had were slides, which I don't have access to anymore.
Now, you are of the generation that women went to college not necessarily to get a degree, but to score a husband.
Exactly, and
Okay.
I did that. It was also a time when women didn't have a lot of choices of careers. At least I thought they didn't at that time. You know, teacher, secretary, nurse, maybe a flight attendant, stewardess we called them, you know. But I had it already ingrained in me that when I went to college I would get a teaching credential, so I would never have to go back to school to get it, like my mother did. And I would get married, and if I could have picked a career, at that point I might have become a minister. But women didn't become ministers in those days. So instead I married the guy that was going to become a minister. This is George at the First Presbyterian, Trinity Presbyterian here in Camarillo. And he did become a minister.
And in fact, that's how you came to Ventura County, was through George's work as a minister.
Right.
So help everyone understand that transition to Ventura County.
Well, we had been living in South Pasadena for a number of years where he was an assistant pastor. And he was called to Trinity. He came, the church was about 4 or 5 years old, I think. I was a seamstress. I even made that jacket that he's wearing.
Oh, that's quite smart. And through that marriage resulted in 2 beautiful daughters.
Yes, two daughters. Kathy is the oldest, one on the left. She lives in Seattle with her 2 sons. One of them is married now, and she's the one who lost her husband just last June. Sandy lives they live in Virginia. Bill works in DC, so they're right close where he can commute. They're great kids. One of them is as conservative as they live, and others are so liberal they hardly have anything to talk together. But, you know, they have managed to still be friends through it all.
That's great.
And I managed to talk to both of them gently, you know.
Now, it was in those early days that you first discovered pottery.
I did, yeah. In South Pasadena, one of my friends was a potter, and she invited some of us to come over and use her wheel, learn to throw, and I did. I threw a lot of pots. One year I even had a pot party, so I could sell
Hopefully the police didn't catch wind of that.
Right.
And then later in your political career, you wouldn't want that to come out, would
That
you?
would not be a good thing.
That's funny. But you enjoyed it. And
I did.
So describe the first time you put your hands in clay, and what was that like? When did you know that you were hooked?
Well, I really did enjoy it, and I kept up with it. All the time I was working on a wheel. In fact, I looked with a little bit of disdain at anybody that did hand building, because that meant they just couldn't master the wheel.
You don't believe that now?
I don't,
Of
no.
course.
In fact, I never really mastered the wheel. That's probably the biggest bowl I ever did, and it's not that big. But I did have a lot of fun with it, and I was still working on it when I was elected, and that's when I had to put it away because there was no time
Right.
to do anything like that.
But throughout your marriage, you were teaching and
Right.
taught for a number of years in the Camarillo School District.
I did. I taught for about 10 years there. A lot of classes, a lot of fun. Some of my students I see today, they're grown up and have children and grandchildren now, and it's great to remember some of those good times.
And a couple of these kids in the background, they look like little troublemakers.
Oh, yeah. One of the ones in the foreground was a bit of a troublemaker.
So you were continuing to go to college also during this time to get your graduate degree?
I had kind of felt that it was time for me to move out of the classroom and perhaps go into administration. I was beginning to think maybe I might be the school superintendent someday, but I did get a master's degree at CLU. I was very pleased to do that.
And so then you decide to get into politics, and you kind of eased in through the Park District, right?
I did. I had a friend who needed some friends on his board, so I ran for the Park District Board and found out I kind of enjoyed being there. And then the Board of Supervisors came along. In the meantime, I had gotten well known in the community because I had helped to pass a school bond, and so I was Woman of the Year. And this is an interesting picture. It'll kind of tell you what year it might have been, because the Woman of the Year, if you will notice, is named Mrs. George Erickson.
And of course, my generation, you know, as soon as I saw the photograph, I thought, Mrs. George Erickson. How does that work? You know, and what an interesting time span that you've lived, including the women's movement, which you became part of. And being married to a minister and going into politics and seeing a lot of changes within our community is very, very interesting and an interesting story. So when you ran for Board of Supervisor, you still had the Erickson name, and it was still Mrs. George Erickson. So at what point did you then switch your name, or were you ever just Maggie Erickson, Mrs. Maggie Erickson?
Well, you know, by the time I was elected, because the Woman of the Year was actually in about 1969 or 70. So I was elected in 1980, so there was a 10-year span in there. And I had been involved with consciousness-raising groups and Ms. Magazine and the whole beginnings of the women's liberation movement, and began to discover that I could think for myself, I could make decisions for myself.
Surprising, isn't
Yes.
it?
I even, I remember one of the biggest things I ever did was buy a painting for the living room without asking for permission. So it was a different time, and when the opportunity to run for the Board of Supervisors came, it was one of those times when I said, this is what I'm going to do, not please may I. And I ran for office and was elected, and by then I was pretty much Maggie Kildee. That time span had allowed some of that to change. And then it was right after I was elected that George and I were divorced. And so that Mrs. George went away.
So how did George feel about this new independence and this kind of untraditional role that you were taking?
Well, it took its toll on
Yeah.
our marriage, I'm sure, but it was happening long before it came to the election.
Sure.
There were things happening that just were not tolerable, and I finally had enough courage to say, it's not tolerable, so let's change what we're doing and do something else. And I think that was good for both of us.
So the big question, of course, is why run for the Board of Supervisors or for any public office? I mean, you know, it is putting you out there and exposing your life and your personal life and your public life. Why did you take on that role?
Well, I think that, there's never seems to be one single reason. But looking back, I can see that one of the reasons is because you have a big opportunity to make a big difference in what is happening in the area around you. One of the major things that the Ventura County Board of Supervisors did was to establish areas around cities that were not to be developed. If a company would come or an outlet center would come and say, we would like to put a development out here in county land, the board would say, no, you have to go to a city. And so that's kept all of the cities with space between them, possibly except Ventura and Oxnard, but the rest of the county, that's pretty true. And that was something that I had the ability to be a part of.
And that's a huge legacy, because the physical makeup of our county was really a result of the tenure you were part of, those 5 supervisors.
A lot of things were happening then. We had the first of the 2 women on the board.
That's right.
I got to be the first woman ever to chair the board. Those were big things to be able to do. And it was a very good feeling to be able to be a part of all of that.
As a Board of Supervisor, I lightly touched on your private life, and being open to scrutiny and stuff. And there was one picture we just had to include in the slideshow that I couldn't help myself. So how did you explain this, Miss Kildee?
On my 50th birthday, I decided to throw myself a party. So I did, and I invited a lot of people. I had another supervisor there. I had the CEO of the county there, and some of my friends thought this would be such fun, and they just sent this young man in. he began taking his clothes off. It was quite an interesting evening.
And I understand a couple of people kind of
A couple of
slipped
people
out.
slipped out the door. They didn't want to have their pictures taken with that happening. I probably should have slipped out the door since we found this. But
Oh, it's just too good to be
yes.
past that. So your day-to-day activities, of course, you met a lot of people, you were involved in a lot of charity work and a lot of very important business. You shared the county makeup, the physical makeup, but you shared with me also one of the more important and highlights of your tenure was the county hospital system. Share with everyone a little bit of insight into that.
Well, those years were a time when the county hospital was there simply to take care of the people who didn't have any insurance or who simply had no money to take care of themselves. And that was a pretty big drain on the hospital financially. And as we struggled to figure out what to do about that, we began to put together a model, and in simplest terms, what we did was allow the county hospital to take paying patients as well as non-paying ones to help with the expense. And that created a terrible political problem because a private hospital is right across the street from the county. And there were some years when there was some really difficult times between the two hospitals. Fortunately now, that's not true, or not as true, I don't believe. But the Ventura model has now been used across the country as ways for county hospitals, because that's one of the requirements of a county. States tell counties what to do. And one of their mandates is to provide health care for anybody that needs it. So that model is now in use across the country to keep county hospitals viable in our country.
Beautiful. And you served 16 years?
4 terms.
Four
right?
terms. Amazing. So among your activities, aside from the governing, you get to participate in fundraisers.
Oh, yes.
And this was a great one. United Way. And of course, always under the scrutiny of cameras. So, but you always handled it with such grace. You really did.
Well, what choice did you have?
You shared with me, you talked a little bit about how, you saw firsthand how personalities can change in those positions.
Being an elected person has a tendency to kind of go to your head. You begin to think that you're pretty powerful. And I would see this when I would go to LA County, for instance. They would say, oh, supervisor this, supervisor. My staff never called me supervisor, they just called me Maggie. But in LA, you didn't do that. And I discovered firsthand, one time I was driving a county car to work, and something went wrong with the car. I don't know what it was. It was still driving, but I knew I had to get some help. So I called the county garage and said, what do you want me to do? They said, take it to Paradise. It's right there, the Chevy place, and they'll fix it. So I drove in, and there's about 7 or 8 or 10 cars ahead of me. And my first thought was, I have to tell them how important I am so I can get to the front of the line. Well, I can tell you the story because I didn't do that. I stayed at the end of the line, but that really impressed me at how quickly that thought came to my head. And I think when I see politicians today where they're really responding to that power that they have, and I think of myself and I think how easily that takes place.
Well, and the importance of staying grounded.
Very much so.
Yes. Well, among the highlights of your career, of course, was the opening of the Reagan Library, and you were able to be part of that wonderful weekend of events. So talk a little bit about how, your role at that point and how you were part of the ceremonies.
It was an exciting time to see that happening. We met the people who gave the land for the library, and we watched the construction of it. And then when the big days came, we were able to be there in the front row, not on the stage, when all 5 presidents were there for the first day. But the second day, some of the supervisors were able to be on the stage. And so we have Vicki Howard from SME, and I was chairman of the board, and so I got to speak.
Which is so
That was really something, to speak with that big presidential seal in front of
Oh,
you.
absolutely. I mean, that is big. And of course, you got to meet everyone, and
Right.
my goodness. And we have a couple of other highlights of some of the wonderful people that you met along the way.
Selma Wilson from Ojai, a wonderful architect, wonderful woman, but an architect and one of the first women architects in the country, has designed some notable buildings in the county.
Including Meditation Mountain, Ojai.
That's right.
And her husband was a very famous screenwriter who wrote Lawrence of Arabia.
Right. And Geraldine Ferraro was running for vice president, and we had lunch together. I was part of the statewide women's association of elected people, not just supervisors. And so we were able to share lunch together. She's a fascinating woman. I enjoyed knowing her.
And I would imagine pretty inspirational.
Very much.
Did you ever aspire to go beyond the Board of Supervisors to more statewide seat?
No, I didn't. I thought about it because, seats became open. Hannah Beth said, "Are you going to run?" And I said, "Well, no." And so she did. But I just really didn't want to have to go to Sacramento or go to Washington, and I really didn't want the political party to tell me how to vote or what to do. I really wanted to stay where I was. I could make my own decisions. I took a lot of pride in that when I retired, a lot of my constituents still didn't know if I was a Republican or a Democrat, which is a good thing, because that allowed me to that was pretty much true of the supervisors at that point. It allowed us to not worry about party lines, but to solve problems.
So, you met the love of your life while you were a member of the Board of Supervisors, and that was the lovely...
Oh, Bob Kildee, yes.
So talk a little bit about Bob and your romance with Bob.
Well, he was, oh my.
Oh, no.
He was a very special man, he really was. I, of course, had known him ever since we came to Camarillo because of the store. At that time, it was a shop for men, and my first husband would shop there, and we would meet Bob. He was just one of the pillars of the community. It wasn't until the middle of my third term that we went out to dinner. He thought about it, went home and talked to some of his buddies and said, "Would this be okay?" And they said yes, and so he bravely asked me out to dinner, and we just had a wonderful time. He was the first time I think I ever really experienced unconditional love.
That's
it
beautiful.
was very special.
Yeah. So he was your right hand throughout all of those political years, or not all of those political years, but the majority of your political years.
Right.
And in that time, you're discovering art and starting to dabble a little bit. And you started stone carving.
I knew that I would probably be retiring at the end of my fourth term. And so I signed up for a sculpture class at Ventura College with Ellis Jump. I didn't know who Ellis was, and I thought we were going to do some sculpting with clay and things, and instead I found stone sculpture. And I had a lot of fun with the stone sculpture. It's not my favorite. I have to brag a little bit because that was bought by Larry Hagman, and so I have this celebrity that's bought one of my pieces.
But you shared with me that this was a subtractive process.
Very different from clay. You do this and you say, "Oops," there's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
With clay, if you say, "Oops," you can put some back. So it's a different process, and I like the clay the best for me.
So clay ended up winning your heart,
It did.
and we see some similarity in your very early work to the stone carving. But quickly you started to get into the figurative work, and the work was always quite large and bulbous. And tell us a little bit about the inspiration in these early pieces.
People say why, and I don't know, but I know that this feeling of roundness is something that always happens. When I was in Cuernavaca, we went to dinner at a beautiful restaurant, and it was outdoor gardens. And there were some sculptures by Francisco Zuniga there. And he really inspired me. The work that he was doing, they weren't round as much as they were just as natural as could be. And that really appealed to me. And so the roundness continued with most of the pieces that I was doing.
So this style started very early on and continued. And in fact, a good friend of yours who owns the Oaks in Ojai,
She asked me one time why I celebrated an unhealthy lifestyle. She owns one of my skinny pieces. Once in a while I do skinny. But I said, you know, it's not really, in my mind, it's not celebrating the fact that they may be heavy. It's celebrating that they have learned to do what they want to do, and they don't worry about whether they look exactly right. In my experience, if they choose to lose weight because it's more healthful for them, that's a good reason, not because it's going to make them be slim and beautiful. So my uppity women do what they want to do and don't worry about how they look.
and that's kind of that rebellion in you, that women's liber in you in a way. I
Probably,
mean,
yeah.
So it's like, take me as I am. I'm not going to be Mrs., you know.
That's right.
Yeah, that I am Maggie Kildee. All of me is here. You have done, as you mentioned, a couple of skinny women, but you also have created beautiful statements. And this particular piece, cast in bronze, has a story, a wonderful story to it. Share the story.
A number of my friends at that time were going through breast cancer, and they had lost a breast or two, and were carrying on with a great deal of courage. And I ran across a story, a letter to Ann Landers, I think it was, that said they had been to a nude beach, and walking down the beach was this nude woman with one breast gone, and it reminded them of the Amazon women who cut off a breast in order to use their bow and arrow more effectively. And so this woman is a tribute to cancer survivors because she has shot her arrow, it's gone, but she's holding her bow beside her. She has won that battle.
That's beautiful. And there was a strange time when so many people that we knew was going through this.
This has also ended up surprisingly at the Norris Cancer Center. An anonymous gift there from someone, I don't even know which one of the pieces was there, but that made me feel very good.
And this was an edition of 10. And you've only done one other bronze piece. And what made you decide to do it in bronze as opposed to doing it in clay?
I was taking a class, and the class was using oil-based clay. And that is a natural conclusion of oil-based clay. But it was not something that I liked to use. I really liked the water-based clay.
Yeah.
And so I came back to that.
So we have some more narratives within the body of work. These are a little more storytelling. So talk a little bit about...
I find pictures in the newspaper, which is what this one is, of a woman who's gathering something, but she has this beautiful crocheted shawl on that was a fascination to me to see her doing that. And some of the more realistic pieces usually are inspired by a picture in the newspaper, an event, some kind of a feeling that made me want to create it in clay.
Among your accomplishments, which are many, was the establishment of the Studio Channel Islands Art Center, which is just an amazing place. And of course, this is the location now in Old Town Camarillo, but tell everybody who may not know the history of Studio Channel Islands and how it all came about.
Well, you may remember that there's a Camarillo State Hospital, and it was closed in the 90s. When it was closed and it was finally decided that it should be a state university, Handel Evans was asked to be the planning president, and he looked at those buildings, which had been built back in the 30s and had now been vacant for several years, and looked at that work therapy building, which was a huge building, but it was very institutional, and it was full of bird droppings and bird carcasses and ghosts and who knows what all. But he envisioned a cultural hub for the university and the community. And he spoke to some friends who introduced him to some artists, and I happened to be one of those artists, and we met and the studio began. We had 20 artists out there. We had a beautiful gallery. We were able to get some wonderful artists to come and to show there. John Nava, Gary Lang. John brought his tapestries before they went to the cathedral. It was a wonderful exhibit. And one of Handel's thoughts was that one of the first professors would be an artist. And he was, and the art department started right away. And it was so successful, it needed our space. And so we lost our space after about 10 years. And we found the school in Old Town Camarillo. Now we are so thrilled to be in that kind of a location. Now we have 40 artists, a beautiful gallery. If you've never been there, why? Come and see it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Amazing, amazing location.
It is.
So we're going to look at a little more mature work now. You do create a patina. This is an acrylic patina. So tell everybody a little bit about your technique.
I've chosen the terracotta clay because I really don't like to deal with glazes and all of that. I like the feel of the clay. I like the shape. That's what I'm interested in. So the terracotta clay works for me. But once in a while, one of them will call for something different. And in one of my classes, I learned to do this. And so this patina, starts with a metallic, in this case it was a gold paint, put on pretty thickly, and then a burnt umber, very thin, put on and stippled so that it dries in a stippled fashion. You can still see a little gold. And then the green maybe cut with a little white. And again, dripped on and stippled. And then I finish it with brown and black shoe polish.
Unconventional.
Yes, real high tech.
You also use a wax over the top of many of your sculptures to give them that little bit of sheen and to seal them.
Right, just gives it a little finish, a little liquid wax.
So this little guy is the only male figure you've done.
It is.
So we had to include him.
Right.
And tell
I
us
had a birthday party at home for myself, and it was a Mexican theme. And actually it was Frito pies. Is that the right name? I can't remember. Where you serve a bag of Fritos and you put the chili in the bag of Fritos. It comes from New Mexico. And then you put all your things on. And I had to serve bowls because there were some people who really couldn't deal with that. But in the process of looking up, that recipe, doing a little research on it, I found out that in New Mexico, in the restaurant where that came from, they have a poster of this.
San Pascual.
Thank you, San Pascual, who is supposed to be the patron saint of kitchens in New Mexico. So I did a sculpture, and he was the centerpiece of my table. And then I made little flat ones, and I gave them to all my guests when they left.
That's
it was fun
sweet.
to have San Pascual there. But he is the only man I've ever done.
And an extra prayer to make sure that strange recipe came out well.
Right. It tastes very good, actually.
Does it really? So the next series of work we're going to get into is a little bit more stylized and start to get into a little more personal work. And many of your figures have these wonderful, charming titles to them. And this is an example of how you come up with the title.
I was kind of playing with being abstract in this one, but when I got finished, usually my pieces will kind of tell me their name before we're finished, but this one didn't. But one of my friends came into the studio while I was finishing it, and I said, well, what do you think? What should I name her? And she said, well, my mother would call her 32 long.
So that worked. So on a much more somber note, this one has a very personal and deep story.
Well, this one, I was working kind of on the technique, or you might say. I kind of liked the line that comes from the top of her head all the way to her toes. So I wasn't thinking a whole lot about what her title should be. But as I finished her, I realized that it was the anniversary of 9/11. It was a year later exactly when I finished her. And I thought to myself that I have been thinking of that as I'm finishing this piece the whole time. So she's remembering 9/11. That's the title of her.
And this piece resonates with emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the more impactful the event is in our life, be it something like 9/11 or the death of a family member and so forth, those emotions often make their way into the work.
Oh, they do. Yeah.
And that's where great masterpieces are born, really. With 9/11, I mean, we all have our own stories, and it was deeply impactful for everyone. But as a government official and you understanding the inner workings of government, were you thinking of your colleagues and the people who have succeeded you in government, and were you affected by not only the event itself, but how our country was handling it politically?
Well, I was not involved politically, but I can't imagine being the president or being somebody in the position of having to make some decisions to say, you can't do that to our country, but the effect that it has on so many people it just boggles my mind that we expect those, and yet we have to make those decisions. Mm-hmm. We don't always make good ones, but we have to make them, and I have to respect people for trying to do their best. That was a tough time.
Yeah. I understand when you are stuck, you make an angel. When you have artist block.
Well, sometimes when I simply don't know what to do and I just have to put my hands in the clay and do something, an angel sometimes is an easy choice, I guess you would say, to make. It keeps my hands in the clay at least.
Well, and you have a deep sense of faith.
Oh, yes.
You do have. Is this kind of like the summoning, almost like a physical prayer? Please give me inspiration?
Well, maybe, but it's subconscious. It isn't, that doesn't come to the fore. But yes, my faith is very, very deep.
Yeah. And this piece is very touching.
Well, after Bob died, I had a terrible time getting my hands back in the clay. He was sick for about 4 months, and so there was nothing happening then. But I knew that, like everybody says, you just have to go and do something.
A lot of angels during that time.
Finally, I was able to pull one piece that expressed grief, and that's this one that you see. I guess we should not have put the pictures of Bob in.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. But it was a beautiful commemorative piece in his memory.
And yes, you can put the picture in. You all need to see what a beautiful man he was. Just very special.
Yeah. And from this mindset and you kind of coming to terms with grief, when you realize that, everybody grieves in their own way.
Someone shared this with me and it really resonated with me. It's a poem, or really a blessing from a book of blessings by John O'Donohoe. And it's one for grief, and he talks about how grief needs to do its work and how different it is for everybody. The way you grieve and the way I would be different. It takes different times, and you have to work at it, and then sometimes you get to feeling pretty good for a while and it'll sabotage you and be right back, and I've experienced that. But then he says, after the grief has done its work, after it's wrung the last bit of it out, you'll find your loved one in your heart where they were waiting for you all the time.
That's beautiful.
And so that's been an inspiration in the clay too, in the sculpting.
So we're going to see a series that in your transition and coming to terms with
this
your
was
grief.
coming alive, beginning to feel like I could live again, and finding him in my heart. This one looks like what I feel, but it doesn't resonate with feeling to me, interestingly enough, but it is that representation. And then finally, dancing in the sunlight. Finally, I can do that. This one is because of the tribute to cancer survivors. I figured there should be a tribute to those who didn't, and this is what that one is.
For the bravery.
That's right.
Yes, a laurel wreath.
The courage of that fight that was fought.
Now, I understand you don't often work from a model, but we do have an example of a maquette that you did do. So talk a little bit about your process.
I don't usually work from a model, usually because it takes too long in the clay, and models don't always sit for long periods. But this was one at the studio where I knew it was going to be a long pose for this model, and so I took my clay in and I did the little sketch, the maquette. And I often do that because my pieces are bigger and I can't decide if the head should go this way or the arm should go where. But on a little piece, I can move it around. Once I get to the big one, it's harder.
So you normally make a maquette for each of your pieces,
Mm-hmm.
and this one happened to be from life.
Right. And so then after that, then I made the big one. And this is what the terracotta clay looks like before it's fired. So this is the piece that's pretty well finished, but she's sitting in my studio waiting for me to take her home to put her in the kiln. And then this is the finished piece after it's come out of the kiln.
The clay body, I was surprised, is very light. You would expect that your pieces are quite heavy.
Well, they're all hollow, and that's one reason. But the terracotta clay is a good choice for me. It has a lot of grit in it. It doesn't shrink as much as some clay bodies do. It will hold itself together pretty well, and I enjoy work. In fact, I put terracotta tiles in my house so that I don't track the dirt. That was when my studio was at home.
Well, your studio was always at home. And in fact, when Studio Channel Islands was located out at the university, you didn't have a studio there, even though you were instrumental in getting the studios for all the other artists.
Right. I was never an artist in residence out at the university, not really until we came into town.
Yeah, and that was after Bob had died. You know, the feeling to get out and
it was a good place to be. At
Yeah.
home, I was by myself all the time, even in my studio now. So that now meaning then. So I decided that it was time to move in with the other artists, and it's been a very good thing to have the kind of camaraderie and to get the critique that can happen as you work to say, why isn't this working? And somebody else can sometimes see what I can't.
You've done a lot of traveling, and what's very interesting is sharing your trip to India on a meditation sojourn.
Well, after Bob died, I realized that one of the things that I was missing, because he and I had had such a good time together, we didn't develop a close cadre of friends as couples. So I didn't have this group to fall back on. Lots of friends, but not those really close ones. So finally I found this meditation group, and that became very important to me, and to be able to recognize that I can meditate with people from a lot of different faiths, not just my own. And this World Community for Christian Meditation put this group together to go to India to meet the Dalai Lama, to be able to spend a day with him in India, to meditate with him. He's having lunch with us here. It was a wonderful time to be able to ask him questions, to have him answer them, but mainly to be able to have this sense of Christians and Buddhists being able to meditate together without the kind of barriers that we often put between us.
And I understand you had some special transportation. Oh my goodness.
We had to climb a trail that was pretty steep, and you can see, when I travel I use a cane because it can be a challenge. And so I opted to pay these guys a bit, and they put that pole up on their shoulders and carried me up. Coming down was a little more of a challenge. It was a little more up and down like this, but I got there safely, and it was quite an experience.
And I understand, your experiences in India led to interesting work and inspired by the people.
I took a lot of pictures in India, thinking that I would do a lot. I haven't done very many, but this particular one did turn into a couple of women with. They carry baskets on their hips, on their backs, on their heads. They seem to be the ones who carry everything. It's really interesting to see them. This gal is a beautiful woman, and she's expecting someone to bring her the chocolates. She's waiting for the chocolates.
Oh, God. Oh. And some of them become a little experimental as well.
Yeah, I get inspired by things that I see, and this kind of yearning, elongated arms. It's been fun to begin to move away from just the Earth Mother kind of Indian women that often come, to doing some things a little bit differently.
So you had a wonderful 80th birthday party.
I did.
And to commemorate the exhibition and the fundraiser and so forth, you created a small little book, which was beautiful and documented a catalog of your work. When you look back in your body of work and all of the things that you've done. How has being an artist helped you as far as being a creative thinker, someone who engaged in politics and problem solving? Did it help you in any capacity?
Well, I'm not sure that I ever become conscious of that, but I know that people who are creative, who are exposed to thinking creatively, sometimes are able to think in new ways, or they're able to say, out of this disaster, something good can come. So even if something doesn't turn out the way I wanted it to, I can learn how to move it and move it in a different way. Sometimes I can do it while the clay is wet. Sometimes I've learned not to do what this was that didn't work, but to do something else. So creative minds can think differently, can not always do it the same way. What if we did it this way? What if I put the arm up here? What if I put it over here? What if I turned her upside down? What if? And if you can do that with the problems that you face, sometimes the solution comes to you, or sometimes you do all of this and somebody else gets the idea and it works it out. So that's why I like being in a creative atmosphere.
We're going into a very interesting body of work. As the work started to evolve from the more bulbous figures, you kind of went into a more angular style, more a modernist approach. So this is the most recent work. So talk a little bit about segueing into this body of work, and how is it that you evolved into the more modern sensibility?
I've had an opportunity to go to week-long classes in Loveland or Scottsdale or Sedona.
And it's important to note that you weren't formally trained in the universities, but in workshops and so forth.
Right, I took art for teachers in college.
Right.
A lot of things I've missed out on. I wish I could go back. I'm not about to. I know you could, but I'm not. Some of my teachers, the people that I worked with over the years now, were doing more things like this. And the idea of making now a woman that is more organic, I don't know what the right word is, but this, her arm just disappears, her hand just disappears into her body. And this sense of being one and of seeing this divine reality inside of me as well as outside of me is a really big thing as I meditate. And I'd like my women to begin to express some of that. I'm thinking more of the more organic or even angular, like waiting for something over here. She doesn't even really have a name yet because she's kind of an experimental thought. And my women usually speak to me, so she is probably waiting for me to do the next one and figure out where I'm going with this. But it's kind of fun to see them be different.
So we're all going to be standing by and waiting.
With bated breath, no doubt. There's lots of things to look forward to.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So we want to certainly open this up to ask Maggie a question or two.
Hi. I was wondering if these pieces are just single-fired? Are they bisque then?
They're just
And
single
that's
fire,
it?
low fire, 06.
And then you apply the,
Some have a sealer, some have a liquid wax,
uh-huh,
or the acrylics.
and then you use acrylic,
Mm-hmm.
and several layers of acrylic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I'm curious about the scale of some of your work. The one image of that was done from life, and you showed the ended product. It looked rather large, and
Most of my pieces are between 15 and 21 or 2 inches tall, the finished ones, because I don't want to figure out how to fire pieces and put them together, and my kiln holds up to that. And the maquettes are usually, 5 or 6 inches.
Do you fire the maquettes?
Usually, yes.
Yeah.
Hmm. Some of them are finished, and I sell those. Some of them are not really finished. They're just very rough, and I don't sell those.
And do you fire in your own studio, or do you fire in the bigger kiln?
I fire in my house. I have my kiln at my house, and so when the pieces are leather hard, I will take them home and fire them, because that means I can babysit my kiln for 6 or 8 hours. It has to be turned up every hour, so it's gas, and it has no automatic controls on it. Don't tell anybody. It's legal because it has I have the permit that says it's okay to have it, but it doesn't have like an automatic cutoff, so that's why I stay home. Don't want any bad accidents.
Mm-hmm. Here's a
One of my favorite pieces of yours was an early piece that was a torso that had the breast that one would expect, and the other side was a rather sagging, shriveled breast.
Was that a stone piece?
Could you share with one of the reasons I loved it too was the name that you gave it. Could you share with people what that name was and what the genesis of that piece was?
That was a stone piece, I think, wasn't it? I think so.
It's been so long.
Okay,
It was one
and
of the first shows you
yeah.
did.
And it's called On Becoming a Goddess, because it's just the torso, not even a torso, just part of her. And the one is a perky breast and one is not, and it's up to you which one is becoming the goddess. But the other interesting thing is it was one of my earliest shows at City National, I think, Bank, the one that was in the tower. And they asked me to take it out of the exhibit and put it in a room off because people were offended by it. So it shows you how far we've come.
I know that meditation is very important to you. Can you explain how meditation has affected both your life and your work?
Well, I can tell you how it's affected my life by spending time every day meditating, and I usually manage to do it every morning. It's simply meaning being quiet and being open. I've been a Christian all my life, and I know how to pray. I know how to have quiet time. All of that has always been quiet time, meaning reading something inspirational or reading the Bible. Praying has always meant either asking for something or saying thank you for something. And meditation is not any of those things. Meditation is simply recognizing that there is this creative spirit or this divine reality inside of me, and being quiet enough. And if you think being quiet in your mind is easy, you try being quiet and not thinking about anything. And it is one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And sometimes I can do it for maybe a minute at a time, and sometimes not. I use a mantra in order to keep from, I call it making grocery lists. People call it all kinds of things, but to keep my mind quiet, I use a mantra. But being able to do that seems to have made me able to be more accepting, more open to people that I meet, making me look at my women and even think about trying to be like them and not care about how I look as much as about what I do, or care about how people I see. I would say, oh my, she really shouldn't be wearing that. She's much too big. And now I'm learning to say, God bless this woman in front of me. I mean, it's a different feeling about people. So that's kind of how I see it affecting my life. In terms of the sculpture, I don't know exactly how I could explain whether it has affected that or not, except I think it affects everything I do. So,
You bring such a unique perspective as an artist with all of that wonderful political career. What do you want to be remembered for?
My two beautiful daughters. I have never really thought about what I want to be remembered for. I hope that the memories of guiding the county in some ways, of helping to establish an art center, of just being a woman whose faith has sustained her. If it weren't for that, my life would not be as good as it is, and I'm grateful to God for that part of it. So all of those things are things I've done if anybody remembers it, that's good, and if they don't, I've done it and I feel good, so that's okay too.
Beautiful. What a great note to end on.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for being with us, Maggie.